What's up, OUXers? I've got an awesome double interview for you today. I'm talking to two design leaders at Atlassian who started bringing OUX to Trello last year. We've got Liam Greig, head of design at Confluence, previously Trello, and Steele, who is the experience design manager at Jira Work Management, also previously Trello. But before we get into this awesome conversation, I just have a few announcements for you. One, if you have been missing me on Twitter, it's because my Twitter got hacked. And Twitter customer service literally did nothing and basically said, we can't really tell that this isn't you. And obviously, it was not me selling offensive t-shirts. So the good news is this actually, they did me a favor by doing this. I've been thinking about leaving Twitter I've been on Twitter, oh my gosh, decades. But I've been thinking about leaving Twitter anyway, to just have one less social network in my life. And we tried a little bit to get it back, but just decided, you know what? It's just things are better this way. So no longer on Twitter. Twitter is becoming a more and more lonely place. And if they would rather have a bot than me, then that's just fine. I don't need Twitter anyway. So if you want to connect, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find there. But even better, come join me in the OUX forum. So in the OUX forum, we've got spaces for really nerdy discussions for OUXers grouped around specialties like information architecture and development and content and research. And soon we're actually going to be introducing more spaces for discussion groups around industries such as healthcare and ed tech and fintech and e-commerce, and all of these kind of really complicated groups that end up gravitating to OUX, really complicated industries. So definitely just trying to find more and more ways for y'all to connect with each other in a meaningful way. Other than the discussions there, I also hold a monthly Q&A session in the forum. You can literally ask me anything. You just, whenever you have a question, you put it in the comments. And then once a month, I go in there and I answer all the questions in a video. Often we'll actually do some object mapping right there, do some diagramming. So it's just a really great, completely free perk of joining the forum. And another cool thing is we've got the first two modules of our 4.8-star Udemy course for free within the forum. So if you just want to get started, get those first two modules and see if you want to do it, this is a great way to join, test the waters, absolutely free. You can go to forum.OUX.com and request to join, and we will let you in. And you'll be on your way to really immersing yourself in the OUX community. There's a lot going on there. So let me welcome you in advance to the OUX forum. Once you join the self-paced masterclass, more spaces unlock for you right there within the forum. So you get more Q&A, you get the OUX job board, and just deeper and deeper conversations around people that are going through the OUX masterclass or have been through the masterclass. So once again, go to forum.OUX.com to join the community there. Okay, let's go talk about OUX to Caitlin and Liam. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the Object-Oriented UX podcast, a podcast about tackling complexity head-on, gracefully organizing massive amounts of information, and designing scalable, future-proof, and of course, naturally intuitive object-oriented user experiences. An OUXer is a powerful blend of information architect, business analyst, facilitator, and UX strategist. If this sounds like you or what you aspire to, you are so in the right place. I'm Sophia Prater, UX designer, chief evangelist of Object-Oriented UX, and your host. Let's jump into it. Liam and Caitlin, welcome to the OUX podcast.
Hi, Sophia. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, awesome to be here.
So we're going to talk about OUX at Trello, at Atlassian overall. And Liam, I actually want to start with you and just kind of start at the beginning. So you reached out to me last year to get OUX training for your team at Trello specifically. This is when you were at Trello. What problem were you hoping OUX could solve for you and your team?
Yeah, right on. I think it's probably a few different problems, but it's interesting because I think I have a history with OOUX, but I just never had the name for it. And so going like back into my career, I'd always sort of practice this idea of like basically building up what we called object diagrams and sort of understanding the relationships between objects in a system. And I found as an individual designer, as an IC, it just made my entire workflow so much smoother and just really helped me kind of lean into the problems that I was trying to solve. But I always really struggled to teach it. And so I didn't have the words to describe it. And so on Trello, I kept prompting designers to think about design before the UI. That was how I said. I was like, look, I need you to do design, but I don't need when I say that I don't mean work on the UI for this thing. I mean, think about, the relationships, the system, the objects, and here's some ways I've done this in the past, but I really struggled to teach it, to be honest. And so when I stumbled on OOUX through your A List Apart articles, it was just a really big light bulb moment for me. And so I think like the thing that I was really trying to get across to the team was that there was this whole design phase before the UI that if you practiced that and really, learn those methods, you'd just be such a stronger designer. And so really leaning into this idea that design starts with understanding the systems, with understanding the objects, with developing a shared vernacular for the system, which is really important. Something that, I think maybe I haven't had that often in the past because I would do this as a solo activity. But all of those things kind of combined when I stumbled on your work, it was just for me like we must get Sophia in the room to help teach this group how to think this way. And it was really about just like learning that mindset shift towards systems thinking in a really kind of structured, organized way around like the objects and the relationships between those objects.
And so this is a question for both of you, but what happens when you start design with UI instead of starting design with systems? What's wrong with that?
Well, maybe I'll just like for me just on like a sort of, I guess maybe as a stakeholder or a designer, I think we just jump into the wrong conversations. Like we start having conversations about like the specific tactical details of a feature before really understanding how that feature fits into the overall ecosystem. I honestly think as well for our cross-functional stakeholders, we set ourselves up for like kind of we're trapping ourselves by basically giving them this like UI to think about that they can just start poking holes in without first establishing some common ground around, what is the set of objects, what is the set of things that we're working with, and how do they work together. So for me, it's about if we jump straight into the UI, we're more prone to missing the really important conversations that we should be having first.
Right. And I like how you bring up stakeholders. I want to come back to that. Caitlin, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that jumping straight into UI really reinforces this concept of like designing screens, which is something that people are like, I have this prototype, there are screens, like it's a design. And you're like, no, 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 no. Okay, that's an awesome solution that you have drawn for me. I think that one of the great parts about OOUX is that it brings all of the disciplines together to really talk about the problem at the right stage when you can make sure that you have really good problem definition, that you're all talking about designing buildable things, and that it's not in this sort of siloed space where you have like design throwing things over a wall to engineering who's like, wait, what am I building? And that it ultimately like is a really lo-fi way to collaborate and like have the most bang for your buck so that you're not sort of fixated on like what an icon looks like or like, is that the flow of what it should be? It's like, well, no. Is that even solving the right problem?
Right. And when it comes to like bringing it back to stakeholders, so Liam, as a stakeholder or working with your stakeholders, working with the business, what I hear all the time is, well, my PMs, my stakeholders, people just want to see those screens. They don't want to be involved in that design before the design before the UI, that it just kind of like melts their brain and they just want to see screens. Have you found that that's true? Are there any ways around that to get stakeholders involved so that they're helping, and subject matter experts as well, they're helping make those decisions before you get to screens?
I think there's like at Atlassian right now, we talk about show don't tell quite often, which is kind of like instead of writing a thesis to actually show something visual to describe an idea. I think that might apply here as well. Like to be honest, for me, this is for a very long time been a solo activity, not a collaborative activity. So I think I'm still kind of onboarding to how to bring more people into the process with the work we've been doing together. But through that solo activity, more often than not, there's a group of people who really see the light. So like this started for me back on Electronic Arts and Ubisoft before I joined Atlassian, but then at Atlassian as well on Bitbucket, I tried to get people on board with the idea of OOUX. Again, I didn't call it that, but that concept. And I really struggled to describe it. But once I showed them some of the outputs that I was creating, people typically got quite excited about it and started really understanding how that could drive conversations at a different level. So, that might be just like building out some object diagrams and then like sitting down and like describing the relationships between objects as an entity diagram. Yeah. And I found more engineers would get excited about that, but product managers as well would be like, oh, that's really cool that we can have these conversations. And once we started having those conversations, I think that would kind of become then the tipping point for wider adoption. But I have not actually had success convincing an organization to adopt these practices without seeing them first.
Right. Of course. Caitlin, what were you thinking?
Yeah. So one of the things about OOUX is that I instantly got it because I was like, oh, this is kind of already how I was working. Because over the course of my career, it's like I started as a designer, but then I became a front-end engineer and then a tech lead and then a product owner and then a product manager and then back to design before I got back into design management. And so I've done all of these different roles in different capacities. So it's like understanding how OOUX solves different disciplines problems sooner, where it's like product is really fixated on scope and impact. And it's like, if you can have a scope discussion with low fidelity versus like, we made this whole North Star, it's perfect. What do we take away? And then like you're shipping like most usable versus most lovable. And the engineers, they want to build a data model that makes sense. And so if you have the sort of like these object diagrams where you've mapped out all the objects and you're having these discussions and building shared understanding earlier, like they get really excited about it. And it's actually something informally I was kind of doing at Lululemon on the mobile app there, where a lot of my current state evaluation and sort of how I would articulate I was thinking about things already was kind of mapping out these objects and like looking through things. And so I think that if you come at it from a place of like, I have a new process for you, that people are really gun shy because there's already too many processes. It's, you don't need to add that, like processes in support of people. And so it's like, hey, I've got this philosophy, like let's try a few things here. And that if you really can kind of like ease them into it, they can very quickly see value and get really excited about it. And then you can start sort of being like, well, what we just did here is object mapping, and start to get them on board with it. And then it just becomes sort of an intuitive thing that people do without it being like a top-down process put on them.
Yeah, 100%. I'm hearing this so much from people that kind of coming in guns blazing, like we are now gonna become an OOUX organization or an OOUX team. Like that does not work. Like you got to just start proving it, showing the value of it, and that could be like slipped in here and there, and then you back up and to say, okay, like this is object mapping. That's what we're doing here. And I love that y'all are saying that, because I feel like a lot of the fear that I get from folks thinking like, oh no, my business folks and my stakeholders, they're asking for screens. They want to see screens. I think, I'd like y'all's reaction to this. Like, I feel like as designers over the years, we've trained people to ask for that. We've basically been like, those are the artifacts where they can actually maybe start seeing what the thing is going to be. And we just haven't had better artifacts to kind of bring people in earlier in the process. So in my experience, what I found is once I can kind of get over that hump and I can start showing an object map and say, okay, this is sort of like how you read this thing and this is how we can work together on it. I found that business folks freaking love it. They're just like, oh man, now we're like really getting into the heart of the matter here. And I can actually layer on my expertise in a more meaningful way versus trying to kind of like reverse engineer screens, which they're not necessarily trained to do, to say like, is this actually going to meet the requirements that need to be met? That conversation can just happen earlier and in that low fidelity way. All right. So doing this workshop at Trello. So this was a very interesting workshop because I had been an avid Trello user for years, absolutely years. Love Trello. Had got actually been teaching people how to do object mapping using Trello. Trello was one of the main digital tools that that I was using. I actually started doing digital object maps in Sketch, and I was running a workshop. Oh my gosh, it was like right before the pandemic. I was running a workshop on how to use Sketch for object mapping. And John Crisp, shout out to John Crisp, was like, have you ever considered using Trello for this? And it was such a mind-blowing moment because I was like, I was using Trello for all my work management. I was using it for all my task management, and I had never considered using it for an object map. And it was just like this, like, you just kind of forehead slapping moment. So I immediately was like, why would I ever use Sketch? I'm going to be using Trello, moving on from here. And I started teaching digital collaborative object mapping using Trello. And literally, but then everybody had been telling me about this thing called Notion. Notion. You got to try Notion. Sophia, you're going to love Notion. And so I finally bit the bullet to start looking into Notion, and had this weekend of like kind of moving my systems over into Notion. And just my husband was like, you're like a 10-year-old boy with a new video game or something like that. So I was like moving away from Trello, which is this tool that I'd loved for so long. And then it was like that Monday, I don't know, it was like the universe aligned, and Liam, you reached out to me, and we ended up doing this workshop, which was, I had all my ideas in my head on like where I wanted to see Trello going and like what would bring me back to Trello. So there was like that kind of like meta excitement about it. And then when we were running the workshop, on Trello. We were OOUXing Trello, and we were even building an object map in Trello, which was a lot. There was a lot going on there. So actually, Caitlin, what we were talking about before we started recording, can you talk about a little bit some of the challenges there on actually OOUXing Trello and even a lot of the other products within Atlassian?
Sure. Yeah. I think that particular workshop, it got kind of hard because when it gets it's so meta so quickly, because you're like, well, let's talk about the card as an object. So we have a list that we're calling the card, and then we've got a bunch of cards in it that are sort of like articulating the core content or metadata, that it got a little bit complicated to talk about. That said, like recently I was trying to compare the object models of two different products next to each other. And I was like, oh, I'll start in Figma and like use stickies, because stickies are great for this. And I did it, and very quickly it became super unwieldy, and it was something that I was like, no. I went back to a Trello board as a way to create an object map, just because it's like it showed me the information that I wanted more quickly. I was able to filter it. It was just there from a usability perspective, because I think like anything with like, unless you're there in person with sticky notes, a lot of the sticky note options, it's just like it ends up with like a sea of sticky note and very little text, and it's also really hard to like sort of comprehensively see everything in an object map. I think one of the things that's really interesting about Trello is that you'll run into with anything with software as service is it's so different from so many of the other like sort of times when you use OOUX. So for example, it's like Netflix, like your content is the product, or if you're Lululemon, your digital content is representative of a physical product that's going to come to you. Whereas something with Trello or Jira or Confluence, what we're actually doing is we're selling the objects, and people create their own instances. It's not that we're creating these components that then have instances sort of auto-populated by content. So I would say that in some ways it's a little extra mind-bending up front, but I would argue it's actually more important that we have these conceptual discussions for these types of things where, you have a great metaphor at one point about sort of instances being the difference between a cookie and a cookie cutter, like the object versus the instance, that it's like the object is the cookie cutter and the instance is the cookie. Well, for us, it's like we're actually selling cookie cutters because we're not actually selling cookies.
And that's so interesting that like that actually in your mind is making it more important, because that is what you are selling. And you are actually selling, when it comes to relationships, you're actually selling the ability to create those cookies and then connect those cookies to each other in a
Yeah.
meaningful way. And if you don't say, okay, here's our cookie cutters and here's how cookie cutters might be able to have relationships to each other, then, you know, that's so much about the product, is being able to say, like, can a card, I'll just throw it out, just an idea. I'll just throw out, like, can a card, what is the cardinality between a card and a board, right? Does a card only have one board? Could a card potentially have many boards? That, just that one relationship totally changes the product. So did you find, like, as you were actually using OOUX for Trello, and then for Jira Work Management, like, and even like retrospectively thinking about it, like you were just doing, like, what would it be like at Lululemon? Does the process change at all when there's so much user generated content, when the users are creating really all of the cookies?
Yeah, it does change things a lot. So I changed the metaphor because I started with cookies because it was a really great way to explain the difference between an object and an instance of an object. But I ended up pivoting and being like, we're a closet system. That it's like we're selling the closet system. Like, that's what Trello does. It's an organizational system, boards,
Yeah.
lists, cards, and it's people's work, the events, ideas, images that are actually being stored in it. So it's like, if you think of, like, I've got the Alpha Closet system from the Container Store, that it's like they're selling this organizational system. And so it's like all of the objects that are in that are designed to hold other objects. And so that was something that ended up, like, being a great way to sort of talk about how we're taming the chaos, because it's like some organizations, the way they're using Trello, it's like what they want to store is completely different from another organization. So it's like somebody who lives in Miami is going to have a whole lot of flip-flops, whereas somebody who lives in Minnesota is going to have a whole lot of boots. And so how you're designing out that closet, but it, like, ultimately you have to sell a system that meets both of those needs equally.
Right, right. Another thing, have y'all run into this at all? Or have you considered, or there have been conversations about users actually being able to name the objects, not the instances, but the objects themselves? So this is something with, we use Mighty Networks for the OOUX forum, and Mighty Networks actually, I like to gripe about them here and there, but they do a really good job of being able to customize this network. It's like basically create your own social network. So I can decide, you know, that my moderators are actually called mentors within the system. So they have an object of person and there's roles, and I can name those roles. Even the within the spaces, I can name, I think instead of calling them, I can name the members of different spaces. So if the space is, for example, cohort 8 is the space, I can name the members cohortions, while in another space, which might be information architecture or something like that, I can name the members or even information architects or something like that. Have y'all had conversations about that, about actually users and organizations being able to name their objects?
And
Yes.
Jira Work Management, you can already do it. Oh, sorry. We already had
Yeah.
our first instance of talking over. You go, Liam, and then I'll go.
Well, on Jira, now Jira Work Management, I mean, this is a tale as old as time, to be honest, because Jira traditionally had an issue was like the primary object of work. It was an issue, but an issue represented something meaningful to a software team, but much less meaningful to all other teams. And so going way back, like Jira used to be one product, and in 2014, 2015, it was instantiated, I suppose, into three products: Jira Software, Jira Service Desk, and now it's Jira Work Management. Back then, we talked about this a lot, and I think the conversation has continued, but it was essentially, it started out actually as a really interesting conversation about what is a Jira product. So, like, at what point would you actually spin off a new Jira vertical versus create a project type inside of an existing vertical? And that conversation centered largely around, does it have a bespoke or a unique issue type, which we essentially called a work item to level that up. So we said, okay, so Jira Software has a work item called an issue. Jira Service Desk has a work item called a ticket, and so on and so forth. And so if you wanted to have, like, you know, Jira for human resources, you might have a work item, or Jira for, like, a, I don't know, hiring, you might have a work item called a candidate. But if you didn't have a bespoke work item, you couldn't make the argument for a new vertical. And so at that point in time, yeah, we absolutely were talking about, well, what if a team has its own, like its own very specific need for a work item that we haven't defined, should we give them that kind of functionality to define it themselves? And I believe that conversation has been happening ever since, like a decade later. Caitlin, you might be closer to that than I am now, but this was like 2014, and it was it was actually a really important conversation for getting to Jira Software, Jira Service Desk, and Jira Work Management at the time.
Yeah, it's something that I think we have sort of more of a position on at this point. But yeah, your unit of work is ultimately like, there's your cookie cutter, and then and like the actual instance, whether it's like whether you're calling it a task or an issue or a bug or whatever it is, it's this unit of work. And the lexicon and how people refer to it is very dependent on the organization that you are. I think the one thing that I would highlight which is it's really important to think of these things as configurations and not customizations. Because the problem with customization is if you go too far down that rabbit hole, you actually can't scale it as an organization grows. It gets very inelegant, and that you're reporting and like that there's all kinds of things that larger organizations like really, really need. Whereas if you have the right amount of customization, then you're allowing teams and organizations to like use the lexicon that they need and create workflows for their business that are incredibly powerful, but you're not hampering the organization to scale as it goes from like one team to 20 teams. Because ultimately, if you end up with too much customization, then you end up living in a world where changing teams is like changing companies. And that's incredibly problematic as organizations get really large, which is part of the challenge of these products, because ultimately you want to serve small businesses, medium businesses, all the way up through to enterprise, and how you're doing that. So it's like the difference between customization and configuration, I think, is really key.
Okay, we got to dig into this. Can you give an example? Like, what would be an example of a customization versus a configuration?
So on like the issue type is one that I would say like we've done a pretty good job in Jira and Jira Work Management, all of the flavors of Jira, I'll say that, of like being able that it's like you can basically at the core, it is an issue. Like that's what it is as far as like backend is concerned. And it's like in Jira software, that's what it remains. But then you can also create that version of a bug. And these things can have sort of like different rules or properties around them. And that as an organization, you can either have company managed or team managed, and how people are able to configure some of these things. But it's like ultimately at the base level, if I were able to just change that and it was never an issue at its core, and it was like whatever word I created for it, that's something that could get problematic. And so it's like if you're like really, if you basically, it's the difference between like letting people modify the cookie cutter, like the base cookie cutter, versus like creating copies of the cookie cutter that then have like slight modifications.
Because and that might be kind of what, so the thing that I like the ability in Mighty Networks to have that level of, I guess, configuration where I can say, I can relabel the thing. Like in the back, it's still just a user, right? But I can be like, oh, you're a cohortion now over here. But what you end up with is actually, even within the, like, if you go from space to space within Mighty Networks, I'm creating inconsistencies. I'm creating these shape-shifting labels. So it's not actually a shapeshifter. It's like, what is a member over here now becomes a cohortion. So for example, somebody going from team to team, it might be called tasks and projects over here, but then like you move to like another another version of Jira, I don't want to use the word instantiation, but like another team on Jira, and it's now called issues and products or something like that. So is that the kind of thing that ends up happening? Is like the same thing ends up getting all of these different names, and that can be difficult to go from like team to team or project to project?
I think sort of a better example of it is a little bit of like, so Trello is like so customizable, and like that it doesn't have the same data structures, that it's like you can make Trello do anything you want. Whereas like Jira Work Management, like you have some structure and some guardrails around those things. And so it's like people can create tasks, they can create bugs, like, but at its core, it's an issue. And so if you have an admin or someone looking or reporting at the very, very top level, like those objects can be filtered by like what at their pure core they actually are, and you have insight into that across like large bodies of work. Whereas Trello, because it's like they're labels and custom fields, that all of these things you're doing, you're not, it actually, it's too amorphous to be able to like have a high level view or to be able to move that work across large organizations. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the custom fields, that would be customization.
Yes,
Right.
customization, so, absolutely.
Okay. And that makes sense that across an organization, if you have these different customizations, now basically a card becomes something so different from potentially one version to another version, or even like one board to another board, right? A card can, because you can have different custom fields related to, it's actually related to the board. You're like setting those custom fields for the board. And this is something that that came up actually for me, was wanting to be able to see cards across boards based on status, but like the status custom field in one board might be slightly different than the status custom field in another board. So now where it's like in progress versus working on, like, because I have a different label, or maybe if I have the exact same label, but then I go change it somewhere else, then it's going to break everything. Yeah. Okay. All right. Customization versus configuration. Love it. Okay, I'm going to pull us out of the weeds. I love getting into the weeds. Going back to post OOUX workshop, we spent like 3 days together. What were the main takeaways? What happened after that workshop?
There was actually a lot of excitement, and it was really interesting because I think that there were some people that got it really quickly. Like all of our content designers, they're like, yeah, this is what I do for a living. Then there were some people that it took them a little longer. I think one of the most interesting ones was Bobby Grace, who's like original designer of Trello, like yes. Trello royalty, an amazing visual designer. And that he took a little bit of time to process this, and then like immediately came back with like this beautiful loom of like, here are some sticky OOUX concepts of like what looking at Trello in this incredibly powerful way. And so that was really exciting. And then I started seeing people talking about it as objects, like objects within their work. And it was, I would say that it's like, it still has a long way to go, but the people who went through that workshop, it definitely shifted their perspective in a way that hadn't happened before.
Are you interested in getting your team fully trained in OOUX so that you can start experiencing some of the magic that Liam and Caitlin are talking about? When you enroll 4 people or more in the OOUX Masterclass, you get major discounts and you get private office hours with me for your team cohort. So for example, if you wanted to get 6 people enrolled, you're going to actually save over $1,000, and you get 3 office hours with me for your team just thrown in there. So go to OOUX.com/team cohorts to learn more. And before I come back to the conversation, I just want to let you know what Ali Agda, a product designer at ServiceNow, previously at Honeywell, this is what she said about this training. OOUX is fundamental training for product designers architecting complex digital spaces suited to users' mental models. Divert those conference dollars wisely. And Rick Williams, senior IA and content strategist for the UK's Government Digital Services, says, easily one of the best training investments you can make, especially if you want to make sense of a mess or synthesize research insights into scalable and user-centered structure. So again, that's OOUX.com/team cohorts. And if it's just you that wants to enroll in the masterclass, learn all about that at OOUX.com/masterclass. The next certification cohort is not going to be until October of 2023. And you do not want to wait that long to start integrating this practice into your work in real, meaningful ways. So honestly, also folks that start with a self-paced masterclass and then upgrade to the certification are so much more successful during that 10-week container. So I highly recommend that. You'll be so glad that you started there. If you've got questions, join me at the forum at forum.OOUX.com and feel free to direct message me there or email us at hello@rewiredux.com. Okay, let's go back to our conversation. I'm so glad you brought up Bobby, and because y'all sent me that Loom video, and it was just mind blowing. It was like we went through the workshop, and of course, like I said before, I had my ulterior motives as a Trello user, and the things that I wanted from Trello. So I was like, I don't know, maybe zhuzhing the workshop here and there just a little bit for my own devices. And then Bobby comes out with this prototype, and I was like, y'all just develop this. Like, this is exactly what I want as the user of one in this workshop, but user / facilitator. So that was really cool to see how it clicked. And then it manifested in screens that were basically reflecting all the discussions that we had about the product. Liam, you were going to say something?
Oh, I'm just thinking about that prototype, but yeah, I think one of the really interesting things coming out of that workshop, actually, I have two things. I'll just kind of riff on them for a moment. But one is, I think it made us a stronger design team. But I don't think that, I think the light bulb turned on for a cohort of attendees, but not necessarily for the entire group.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of wanted to chat with you about that, because to me, that felt like a success. And I feel like OOUX is a very specific way of thinking it. It almost becomes like another, craft specialization in a way. And so, as you know, at the time, the head of design for Trello, one of my goals wasn't that every designer became like an OOUX certified master. It was that enough of us did, that skill set existed on our team in a substantial way that could help us, have these conversations and move forward as a stronger team. But I don't. I think it's like similar to like interaction design or visual design. I think some people will really take to it and become like the light bulb will go on and they'll get super strong in this area, and others might not. And I think we felt that coming off the workshop. There was certainly a cohort that really gravitated towards this way of thinking, and we've seen that in their work ever since. And another cohort who took the workshop and maybe just moved on from it and kind of continued doing their thing.
Yeah.
Kind of want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's not for everybody. It's really not. As much as I want it to be, as much as I want a matrix style downloaded into everybody's head, it's really not. It's a way of this kind of like the being able to think systemically and being able to think like that, and to be able to see that kind of bird's eye view and see how these interlocking pieces work together and drill down into a different type of detail. Like, I don't drill down very well into interaction design detail. Like I muddled my way through it early in my career, and I was happy to say, like, I don't do interaction design anymore, because that's not the kind of detail that I'm good at. But the kind of detail that I am good at is going in and saying, like, oh, actually, are these two type fields, are they mutually exclusive, or are they not mutually exclusive, or is there conditional logic between them? Like, that's the kind of detail that I really like getting into. So it's like the type of high level and the type of detail thinking is very different for somebody that might say, from a high level perspective, I can really see brand. I can really see how brand elements work together at that high level. And then when I go into a detail level, like bring on some micro interactions and some like really delightful animations, versus that high level thinking of being able to see how objects in a system interact, and even how objects outside of a system interact. And that kind of like, it's like the type of person that likes to solve puzzles. It is a different type of person. And I agree, like just having, but I think that there's an appreciation that needs to happen, right? So even if you are more on the UI design or interaction design, or you're more of a visual designer, I still want, if I'm working with a visual designer, I want them to have an appreciation for this, because I don't want them to introduce shapeshifters and masked objects and isolated objects and broken objects, right? I want them to think about, okay, when somebody is before you design the flow for creating the thing, I want you to have an appreciation for, let's define what that thing is before you design all the screens for how to create the thing. So there's like, I love seeing an interaction, and we have interaction designers in the course that go through it, and they gather that appreciation for it and that understanding for where it applies to them. So once that they can recognize, okay, I've got a shapeshifter here, I've got a masked object here. While on an OOUXer side, or on that information architecture side, of course you got the appreciation for the interaction design as well, even though you're not doing it.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. And I do think being able to recognize those kind of those shapeshifters and other patterns across the team is really valuable. Just really briefly as well on the Bobby prototype and the kind of containerless card concept. And Sophia, if you were leading the witness a little in that workshop, you were leading us to a really cool place. So
Okay, good.
it was all good. But I think that just reflecting on that a little bit, I think that if as a standalone product, I think we would have been in a position to really chase after some of these ideas sooner. So like, I think we were all really excited about some of the concepts coming out of the workshop, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are probably in a similar situation, but we're part of, like, Trello exists as part of a much larger suite of products. And so I think running OOUX on a single product within Atlassian suite is powerful, but it still runs into the inevitable kind of limitations of the role of that product within a larger ecosystem. Which I know Caitlin's digging into quite a bit now, but I think that that's just something that maybe we didn't anticipate during the workshop. Was we treated it as a standalone product.
Right.
I think we really did. We thought Trello standalone product. What's all the how can we apply OOUX in a really cool way to this product in that sort of standalone mental model? But once we got back into the ecosystem, it was a whole other conversation.
Caitlin, you're working on something like to kind of how you bring this ecosystem together.
Yeah. So I think Liam's spot on in some of what he's talking about. Like, just last note on the like little bit before I go into this, on sort of like not OOUX isn't like for everyone. I do think though that it's like we're building balanced teams, and with team topologies, that it's like as long as you have someone who's great at OOUX balanced with someone who's amazing at visual design, those two people are more powerful together than if both of them were like pretty good at both of those things, like, but not amazing at it. And it's that tension that's going to lead you to the best results right there on that one. On the other thing is, yes, looking at Trello like isolated as its own thing is a very, very different problem rather than like looking at it as part of like the Atlassian ecosystem. And you have all of these different products, and it's like, how do they work well together? But it's like recently I had a situation where I was like looking at two products side by side, and I was like, how can I make these two products work better together? And this is where OOUX was actually incredibly important. And I was like, oh, great, I'm going to do an object map. And, my product counterpart was like, that looks like that's too in the weeds. I don't want to go that deep. And I was like, no, really, for me, like, this is current state evaluation. I need to understand this. And I was very quickly able to understand like how the objects in the two products kind of fit together or didn't fit together, or where they were like too similar, but not similar enough, like all of these various things. And I was able to map it out. And then we had a meeting, like brought in engineering for a spike of discussing this. And it's like the engineers were like, yes, this is what we want. Because in order for them to be to participate in that conversation, understanding what the existing objects are of these two very disparate things and how they might fit together, we were able to get much more quickly to a technical place of conversation in the spike than if we didn't have any of that. So I think that even in these situations where you're not like, I can transform this single product, but you're looking at these more complicated projects, I think that there are sort of tools within OOUX and like the overall philosophy that are still incredibly powerful and move the work forward much more quickly. And like people might feel it slowing it down, but like that meeting where the engineers were like, yes, I was like, see, we made it faster. It felt slow, but it actually was faster this way.
So I really want to dig in here, and anybody to get kind of your advice for anyone that is dealing with something like that. How do we merge these two products together, or how do we figure out how these two products can work together? Because we've got so many people using OOUX in enterprise environments that are dealing with exactly this. So how did the process work? I know it's a huge loaded question, but how did the process work for you to do that and to get some of those insights? Like, if you can like paint a picture, get into the details on what that looked like.
Sure. Yeah. So the first thing I did was open a Figma file. This was the instance where I was like, oh, I need to go back to Trello. But I started in the Figma file. And what I did is like I had product A and product B, and then actually product C, because I took a competitor. And I was like, somebody else that's doing something kind of similar that we're interested in. And so then I mapped out the object models, or created object maps for all three of these different things, so that I was able to look at kind of like, where would the puzzle pieces fit well together? Where is there zero connections? And then I learned a huge amount by doing an object map for that competitor, of like looking at their pieces. Cause I was like, oh, there's some really interesting ways that they look at some of these things that are actually maybe more powerful than we're doing this. And so I was able to create a conceptual model for myself that then I was able to articulate to some of like the lead designers that I was working with, where like they very quickly were like, oh, okay. And like they did a much better job of storytelling, of like, okay, well, if this is it, like let's look at like use the solar system as a metaphor for like containers of work, and like how you've got your solar system as your container of work, and then you get down into your planets, which is like your project. And then you get down into like, you have your actual like task, which is like, like preventing global warming, like, or turning it around, like all these different things. That was incredibly useful for like storytelling around it. But just having, I think like it was the first time that I'd done the competitor object map on that one, to kind of like understand something else there. Because I think that we look at these things, we're like, oh, it's similar but the same, but like they use more colors or not enough colors, or they're easier to use, or whatever those things are. But by breaking it down and distilling it into its component objects, I was able to I created a grid of like every single object for across the three products, of like what either was there an open space where like one wasn't doing something, or like here like the things that are like identical, the same, or like, oh, close but not quite there, that I think brooked a lot of really interesting conversation cross-disciplinary.
And this is all current state, modeling current state?
Yes. And then moving on to being able to create this new sort of object map of like, what if like there was an overlap? Like, what if something totally different? Like, what if we like rebuilt something different? What if we like invented a new product that we did something? Just to be able to have a lot of more full conversations.
Awesome. Very cool. This is something that we did. I was telling y'all before we hit record on the workshop that I ran for the Church of Latter-day Saints last week, and how we OOUX'd their kind of entire organization and religion. And we started finding connective tissue. And I don't want to get too much into it because I'm probably going to do a whole podcast episode on that. But yes, being able to like see, okay, we have an overlap of objects where like they're like objects that are almost the same but not quite the same, and then we have a delta where there's different objects, but potentially how might those objects, I think it's really interesting thinking about how those objects might nest within each other. So like the host, if you will, the host object might live in product A, but can a product B object nest inside of it and connect inside of it? Which is, y'all are nodding your head. Cool. Liam, did you have more thoughts on this?
I'm actually just really excited to dig into the work that Caitlin's been doing. I've been listening and kind of going, "Ooh, that sounds fun." So I have a few links from her, but haven't dug in. But that's interesting as well. Just like you kind of described this a little bit, Sophia. But like I think it is like what Caitlin's describing is like being able to, I don't know, just like see the system in a brand new way that is really powerful. Which like I think. Because I was thinking as well about, you were asking about just like how do we introduce this to an organization, like that type of thing. And it is, I felt like there was almost an implicit assumption in that question and some of the conversations we've had that you need permission, but you just don't. And like, because the big thing here is, and so for me, I was just kind of like, oh yeah, this makes so much sense to me. And on an individual level, anytime you start on a new product as a designer, the first thing you should do is map out the objects. And you do not need permission to do that. And that might lead to some really rad conversations, or it just might make you as an individual better at your job, because you'll be able to see a much clearer picture than you otherwise would have. But yeah, like Caitlin, your work is propagating throughout Atlassian, but even if it hadn't, just hearing you describe the system that way is powerful, right? Like you see those connections, which I think is really, really awesome.
Yeah,
What?
non-linear thinking is my superpower. So like this is something that it's like is a really great thought exercise for me, but it's like just what we're talking about. It's like I think, yeah, it's great when you're starting with a net new product. Awesome. Congratulations. Good for you. Like those start all the time. But if we're honest, like 90% of the work that designers are doing is working with existing things. It's like we're not all architects who get to be like, this is fresh, unbroken ground. Like, let's create these concepts. It's like so often it's like, yeah, we've got this house and it's got like 3 bedrooms, but like there's like a weird swampy pot or land back out there, and then we like want to add a room and a level and like add 3 new bathrooms. Like we're always adding on to things, I think.
Yeah.
And that it's like that's where having a deep understanding of current state for something before you add anything on is a really great first step.
Yeah, 100%. And that object map gives you like that X-ray vision into a current state. And so you're talking about how we can think about how these products might connect. On the other hand, often work is at this very almost like feature level work or section, even like not even a full page, but like part of a page. And I had a call with some folks working on, I won't say exactly what they were working on, but some part of Trello. And it was a very, I'll say, boxed in part of Trello. And we actually had a really productive conversation on how OOUX could be applied just to literally a section of a section. So it can really go both ways. It can help you think about how things connect. But even if you are tasked, and I'm just kind of like talking to the listeners out here who might be tasked with something that's like not necessarily merging 2 products together, but like half of a page or a widget on a page, you can apply OOUX at that level too.
I'm curious, Sophia, like would you because in that scenario, would you first want to have the kind of fundamental understanding of the like systems objects in place, or are you talking about going into that and just defining like practicing OOUX on a sort of specific part of a product without necessarily having done the
really like just sometimes that's what you have to do. I mean, I love that big picture thinking. That's what I gravitate to. But the reality is so many projects come down the pipeline, so to speak. They're very myopic projects. I don't think it's the best way of working is these very myopic siloed projects, right? Like we're just going to redesign the navigation, or we're going to redesign like this part of the homepage, or we're going to design this like one little feature. We're going to refresh this one feature without thinking about how it fits in the whole. But what OOUX helps you do actually is find how it actually, where does it connect to other things? So at least you're aware. You're at least don't have your blind, even though you're the where you can act and your locus of control is might be cinched in quite a bit. You at least understand what other things it's connected to and how it kind of like how it's connected in that whole spider web. And maybe if I move this over here, I'm actually going to create a shapeshifter. So maybe I'll keep it the same. So it just gives you that awareness and potentially could even break down the barriers. Not scope. Sometimes scope, we talk about scope creep like it's a bad thing. I mean, sometimes expanding the scope for a project is a good thing because you're thinking about, okay, we just can't redesign this, to use the Zooilana example that I use in the Udemy course. Like we can't just redesign the membership level page. We need to think about membership within like, what does it look like when you're logged in to be a member? What does it look like when the admins look at all the members of the zoo? Like it's much more, it turns into a much more productive project and kind of body of work if you think about all those connections and maybe can bring in some of that connection and expand your locus of control a bit. So before we wrap up, oh, sorry, Caitlin, yes.
Oh, it was like just the house metaphor. It's like if you understand that a house has 4 bathrooms versus 1 bathroom, you're going to remodel that bathroom differently, even if it's just like a very small portion of it. And like all of your complicated things is the plumbing that it's plugged into. So anyway, sorry.
No, that's a great metaphor. I've actually never, I use the house metaphor all the time. And that's great. Like you might, when you renovate, if you only have 2 bathrooms and you're renovating a bathroom, you might try to put that extra shower in or something like that, right? Versus, oh, this can stay a half bath or whatever. That's a great example. So I want to be respectful of y'all's time. And if either of y'all have to run to a meeting right at the hour because you're about to be late to that.
I have to make lunch for a 6-year-old, but it doesn't have to be on the hour.
Okay. Okay. I'll
I
I'll steal
I
3
can
more
be
minutes.
I can be a minute. I can be a couple minutes late, but yeah,
Okay.
I have a 5 minute hard stop.
Okay, wonderful. I want to just get y'all's final thoughts on advice. So, Liam, starting with you, what advice, and you kind of already touched on this, but I want you to really distill it down for folks that are wanting to convince people like you. They're wanting to convince their director. They're just like they want that kind of like top-down endorsement for OOUX. So they've fallen in love, they're an individual contributor. What advice would they give to kind of send it up the ladder?
Yeah, I think we touched on it. And I think first off, like do it for yourself first. Like I think that's a really important starting point is just like practicing OOUX or really understanding the system that you're working with is going to be if you really get deep into that world, it's a superpower and you do it for yourself to be a better designer. If you've achieved that milestone and you feel like you really understand it, now you're trying to advocate to a broader group. Um, Show don't tell, as we kind of touched on earlier, like bring some of the outputs, bring some of the artifacts to the team, so that they can actually, I think, see that firsthand, and it will spark the conversations that Caitlin was describing with the engineering team on like Jira Work Management and Trello. And yeah, I think it's really difficult to just advocate for the process without having something visual or something concrete to actually share and show. But I think once people see it, they typically get on board. Like I think it's a process that people tend to really appreciate once they've had a chance to dig into it. But I really do think do it for yourself first.
Right, right. Prove the value. A
Mm-hmm.
term has been floating around of quiet OOUXing.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it.
And then you just kind of have the sticky notes in the background and you're just kind of like, yeah, this is just what I use to understand stuff. We can talk about it if you want to. And then Caitlin, from the actual flip side, if you're a manager trying to get your team on board or trying to get your counterparts on board, any advice for that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like Liam, still starting with, yeah, like, use it yourself first. I think, especially depending on what blend of like player coach versus just pure manager you are, I think showing value and impact. And so it's like, if you can't necessarily do it internally, you can find external examples of what people have done and be like, hey, check this out. I also think that you and Joe Natoli's Udemy course is a game changer. Like, this isn't something where we have to be like, we have to have Sophia in for this week-long workshop, like, which was amazing. And I would totally do again in a heartbeat. But, depending on organizations and budgets, particularly these days, like being able to like seed 1 or 2 people that are interested in it and see it as a growth opportunity to like try it out, take the class, start playing around with it. And then from there, it kind of like growing out. Like you can't do a top down approach with any type of like leveling up of training where you're like, all of you are going to take this training by the 17th. Like that doesn't work. But there are always designers that are hungry and eager to do things differently and to get better at their craft. And that this is an opportunity to like have them learn OOUX. And then we have that impact that we can show to, the director or whomever further up the chain is making decisions.
So going back to, oh yeah, go ahead, Liam.
I was just going to say land and expand. It's like it's what we use internally to describe our product growth, but I almost feel like that is applicable here, which it shows success at like with a small team, and other people will see that, and it will, propagate from there.
Yeah, it'll happen with time. So, and then last question for both of you. So kind of going back to that idea of OOUX not being for everybody. So as a manager, I mean, one way you can do it is to say, hey, does anybody want to take this course and see who bites? Is there something like for the managers that are listening that might want to pluck you people out for the Udemy course, or potentially for, we actually have a couple people who have bought seats for the masterclass and they're trying to figure out who to get into the masterclass. How do you recognize somebody? What are the traits you might look for to recognize somebody that's like, this person is going to be, they're going to be an OOUX, or they're going to love this? Caitlin, what do you think?
First, I would look for strong conceptual thinkers. And I think that one of the really undervalued areas who are like huge proponents of this is content design. And that they are really doing a lot of conceptual work early on, and that this is something that it's like they're not just writing copy. That's not what content design is. And that this is something that's really, really helpful for them. So it's like people who are either conceptual thinking is really a weak area and they want to grow into it, or people who are already really strong on it and interested. But I think content design is an area like this isn't just limited to product designers.
100%.
Yeah, I would only add that I think that is, I'm aligned with that, like content designers, conceptual thinkers, but also leave some room for people to surprise you. Like on the Trello side, we actually did a little bit of a self-selection model. We put the word out and said, hey, look, we're going to be running this training, and we actually have some budget to put some of you through the certification. Like, who would be interested? Who has a passion for this work? Who would, like, you know, be willing to put their time into this? Because we were looking for a commitment. We made it very clear that signing up is a commitment. And we had some people that signed up that maybe we weren't expecting. And some of those people turned out to be really good. So I think there is definitely, like, leave some room for surprise on your team.
100%. All right. That was an amazing conversation. Caitlin's got a meeting. Liam has got a baby girl who needs lunch, who is homesick. So we are going to peace out. Happy OOUXing, y'all. Thank you so much for being here. That was an awesome conversation.
Thanks, Sophia.
Thanks, Sophia. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit objectorientux.com/podcast for show notes. Our soundtrack is Fighter by Ruby Bell, courtesy of Sugaroo Records. Happy OOUXing!